Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. In this video, we're just going to talk a little bit about mortal sin, specifically from the vantage of, like, how do you know if you've committed a mortal sin? Maybe it's just tough to determine because, fine shades, and is there a threshold over which I traversed, and how do I make all of these difficult moral judgments? All good questions. I don't know that we're going to solve all of them in the course of this short video, but we can at least furnish you with some principles to live your moral life more excellently in a way that gives rise to greater holiness. So that is what we're going to attempt. So let's do it. All right, so the question which informs this particular video reads thus. A lot of times my stream of conscience turns sexual, and I don't know when it becomes mortally sinful to subconsciously think these thoughts. Any advice? Yes, I get confused sometimes. Stream of conscience, stream of consciousness, whatever. So my thought stream gets hung up on sexual things, and I don't know if I've committed a mortal sin. Great question. Maybe certain people don't struggle with this particular temptation. Maybe for them it's anger. Maybe for them it's like excessively anxious rumination on whatever. But at a certain point, you might pose to yourself the question, has this become sinful? Or if sinful, has this become gravely such? So when you're trying to make that out, or trying to sort that out, for a mortal sin, there have to be three component parts. So first, it has to be grave matter. So that means it has to be a pretty big ticket item. And usually, the list that we point to is the 10 Commandments. In the Old Covenant, transgression against one of these commandments would have incurred the penalty of death. So they were fatal. They were mortal. And in the New Covenant, right? So in this new time, wherein the grace of the Holy Spirit is given to us, we think about them as fatal or as mortal, albeit in a different way. So whereas formerly you would have perished in losing your natural life, now you perish in losing your supernatural life, which is to say the mortal sin actually strips you of the life of grace. All right, so that would be grave matter. So like small things, like I left my light on after my mom reminded me 3 times to turn it off because it wastes energy and we're just trying to keep the electric bill down. All right, so that'd be like just a light thing insofar as you were forgetful, insofar as you were disobedient, insofar as ... All right, but if you were like, yeah, my mom kept nagging me about turning the light off, so I, blew up her car. That's okay. That's a bigger deal. So yes, that's helpful. Grave matter. Next, you have to have knowledge of the activity. So it can't be something of which you're wholly ignorant, or of which you're wholly ignorant in a way that's not culpable, or it can't be something that you do when you're sleepwalking, or it can't be, you get the idea. So it's something that you have knowledge of. You have knowledge of the activity, and you have knowledge of the fact that it is sinful in some way, shape, or form, or at least that it's not in accord with the law as you currently understand it. And then third and finally, you consent to it, okay? So you give yourself to it. And yeah, here it can't be an activity wherein you're coerced. So somebody like puts you in a arm manipulation robot machine and is like, now you will commit the mortal sin. You're like, no. Okay, so that doesn't qualify. Nor even in certain instances where you're so terrified that you kind of like snap, as it were, and just like run away from a situation or do something entirely out of character, that really doesn't qualify as consent either. Okay, so grave matter, knowledge, and consent. And what we're trying to establish is, in our own kind of interior life, when are we considering something that's grave? When are we considering something with sufficient knowledge? And when are we giving ourselves to it? And here I think it's helpful just to talk about how a moral act progresses. Okay, so typically you conceive of something as an option, right? This is possible, and then maybe you wish for it at a certain level, and you're like, yeah, that could be cool. I'd love to fly. And then you maybe make an intention. You're like, I'm gonna make myself a flying suit. And then you go through the different options which might secure this end for you. You're like, okay, I could do like a base jumping squirrel suit, or I could buy myself one of those hang gliders, or I could, so, and then maybe you consent to one of them. You're like, definitely base jumping, definitely squirrel suit. And then you formulate a plan as to how you're going to bring this out. You're like, I'm going to go to the top of El Capitan with my new squirrel suit, and I'm going to jump off, and I've seen videos about it, and it's always gone well, so it'll be great. And then you perform the act, and you're like, I'm falling, all right, and I'm trying to hold my arms open, but this is really difficult. And then maybe, the last stage would be you kind of experience a repose in the activity. It's like, yes, I enjoy this. And here I think that the example that I've used no longer applies because it seems headed in one particularly fatal direction. Okay, so I think when we're talking about mental activity, even though the example that I gave is a description of embodied activity, when we're talking about mental activity, we observe certain stages of progression. So a thought kind of dawns on your mind, or it knocks at the door of your heart. And there's a sense in which we may kind of give it entry by inattention. All right. So it's like, yeah, that's a thing. Okay, fascinating. But then there's a moment in which we seize upon the thought. Okay. So we intend it, as it were. And that's like a moment in which we open the door to the thought. And then you might go from there to kind of manipulating the thought, or like entertaining the thought in a conscious way, or toying with the thought, or playing the thought out. And I think those steps are kind of like when we entertain means, and then we consent to those means, and then we choose those means. And then, you might find yourself in like the kind of full activity of performing the action and eventually enjoying the fruits thereof. And at each stage, we show ourselves more wholly committed to the activity, okay? So there's a kind of commitment of thought and a kind of commitment of love. So it's something that we know, and it's something that we choose. At each stage, we show ourselves more devoted to it. We show ourselves more kind of characterized by that activity. And I think that it's very difficult, right, to establish when you've crossed a particular frontier in fine shades of interior actions. I think a sure sign that you have committed a mortal sin, provided we're talking about something that's grave matter, and we're talking about something of which you have knowledge, right? When you've committed a mortal sin is when you enjoy it. And then, because that's kind of the testimony of a completed action, or the testimony of something that you have seen through to its end. Now, if you back up those stages, I think that around the middle, where we find ourselves kind of like manipulating the thought or entertaining the thought in a more conscious way, that's kind of the fault line, all right? And there's no point at which we can, we're not going to be able to make a moral determination like, if you have thought about it for between 4 and 5 seconds, you're in the clear, but more than 5 seconds, you are not, because it's just so hard to say. Not just in the mere matter of like, how do you establish that type of thing, but also in the sense that we might be talking about an act that's more or less grave, and we might be talking about it in a circumstance which is more or less trying, and as a result of which it's going to each demand its proper consideration. So then what do we do? Well, the response of some who inquire into moral matters is to like establish like, how would I describe this? It's to evaluate each case on its own terms, to kind of make a list, as it were. Like, if it's this set of circumstances, then you're in the clear. If it's this set of circumstances, you're not. If it's at this time and place, then you're in the clear. If it's at this time and place, that you're not. If it's for this many seconds, you see where I'm going here. But I don't think that's actually fruitful for us. I don't think that it's actually helpful to do that, because I think it's more helpful to acquire principles, all right? So to understand what a mortal sin is, to understand what distinguishes it, from a venial sin, to have a basic sense of the stages of moral action, to think about the virtues which form us in pursuit of the good and, the evasion of the evil, and then to seek to grow our moral lives in accord with that. The sacrament of confession, which is a forum in which we need to know the mortal sins that we have committed, is obviously an excellent place in which to receive the grace of God and to receive impetus for ongoing moral conversion, but it doesn't demand of us like kind of exacting perfect knowledge of every time that we have committed a mortal sin. So you might just go and say, I don't know if this is mortal or venial, but these are the circumstances and it happened X number of times. That's sufficient. God's grace heals that, restores you to a state of, lily whiteness, adopted sonship or daughtership, right? And then grows you towards the good for which you are presently striving. So I would say, don't get too terribly hung up on evaluating fine shades of moral culpability or moral fault, but choose instead to interiorize principles which equip you to live your moral life in a way that's exemplary, in a way that's excellent, and in a way that kind of leaves those types of considerations behind. Now, does that might mean that we become sloppy? in our moral lives and be like, probably fine. Probably no. I'm not encouraging that. I'm not encouraging laxism. By the same token, I'm not encouraging rigorism. But what I am encouraging is a kind of approach to the moral life which is prudent, which is wise, which dwells not overly much on the sinful things, making of those sinful things the primary focus in his or her moral life, but which dwells rather on God, who is capable of ridding our lives of those sinful things and setting our thoughts on things which are above, things which are infinitely more worthy of our consideration. So, yeah, I would say that in the moral life, it's more fruitful to think about crowding sin out than it is to think about rooting sin out. Because if we try to root it out, we'll always come up exhausted. But if we try to crowd it out, which is to say, if we try to cultivate a relationship with our Lord, which becomes more and more consuming, more and more defining of who we are and what we love, then I think that we'll, kind of wake up many months hence and come to discover that the things which formerly plagued us no longer do, because God has grown us beyond them, because he has taken us by the hand and led us further up and further into the divine life which he seeks so ardently to share with us. So that's not to dismiss the question, but that's just to frame the question in the way in which I think it's most fruitfully considered, most fruitfully entertained. And that, my friends, is all that I intended to say in this video. So if you haven't yet, please